For a heartbeat, the entire room forgets how to breathe. The air feels heavier than marble. Every eye in the chamber is fixed on Jasmine Crockett, her posture steady, her tone still echoing through the vaulted walls. "So, Your Honor, are you saying justice depends on who's asking for it?" The words linger like smoke after a gunshot. Judge Eileen Cannon doesn't move. Her gavel hand trembles just enough for the cameras to catch it. No one dares to speak first. Reporters grip their pens mid-sentence. Even the hum of the air conditioner sounds intrusive. Crockett doesn't flinch. She's done this before, looked power in the eye, and refused to blink. Across the bench, Cannon adjusts her glasses, buying seconds to gather herself. But the silence has already chosen sides. Phones come alive before the moment even ends. A single clip races across social media, Crockett's voice steady, Cannon's silence deafening. Within minutes, hashtags ignite, hashtag question of justice, hashtag Crockett moment, hashtag silence speaks. Cable news producers scramble for the footage while staffers in the back exchange stunned glances. Something irreversible just happened and everyone knows it. Cannon finally clears her throat, trying to restore order. But the authority she leans on feels suddenly fragile, like glass already cracked. Her reply, measured, deliberate, lands with the dull weight of bureaucracy. "Congresswoman, this hearing is not a forum for personal judgments." Crockett smiles faintly, the kind of smile that says personal judgments. "No, this is about public truth." Somewhere in the back row, an aide whispers. She actually said it. Another mutters, "This is going viral." The energy shifts. The hierarchy of the room reverses. The judge's robe no longer feels untouchable. The congresswoman's words hang above it. Brighter, sharper, undeniable. Outside the chamber, headlines start writing themselves. Crockett challenges Cannon and wins the room. Commentators begin cutting montages before the gavel even falls. The moment is already legend. But beneath the spectacle, something deeper stirs. A sense that this wasn't just a clash of personalities, but a collision of principles. Truth versus comfort. Accountability versus power. And in that split second of silence, America saw which side trembled first. To understand why one question could shake the room and the nation, we have to go back to where this tension began. For weeks, the headlines had been circling the same question. How far could a judge's power stretch before it stopped serving the people and started protecting itself? The nation's attention turned toward a congressional oversight hearing that promised nothing more than bureaucratic routine. Cameras were in place, transcripts ready, the same dull rhythm expected. But beneath the marble calm of Washington, a storm was brewing. Eileen Cannon had built her reputation on precision and restraint, the kind that masks conviction with composure. Her rulings had drawn quiet applause from some, but fury from others who saw a pattern. Decisions that tilted too comfortably toward those already sitting on pedestals. Critics whispered about favoritism, about rulings that bent around power instead of standing firm against it. Yet Cannon never flinched. Her robe, her title, her courtroom, they were armor. No one questioned her in public. Until now, Jasmine Crockett had spent months watching the system play defense while justice took the blows. Each hearing, each report, reinforced what she already knew. The problem wasn't just bias, it was insulation. Too many in high office mistook accountability for insult. To them, scrutiny was rebellion. To her, it was democracy breathing. So when her name appeared on the committee roster, the chatter began. Staffers said she'd be fiery. Others warned she'd be too direct. But Crockett didn't come to Washington to be polite. She came because truth, in her words, doesn't whisper, it interrupts. The stakes went far beyond legal process. This was about whether Americans could still believe that justice was blind, or if it had quietly learned to squint at who stood before it. Cannon represented the institution, fortified, aloof, almost regal. Crockett represented the people, loud, flawed, but fiercely unwilling to be ignored. The day of the hearing arrived under the kind of false calm that precedes earthquakes. Cannon entered the chamber like a monarch entering her court, chin raised, every movement measured. Crockett sat across from her, pen in hand, eyes steady. the embodiment of everything the judge's world found inconvenient. Unfiltered truth delivered by a woman who refused to lower her tone to fit the room. Outside, the press described it as a routine review of judicial ethics. Inside, the air said otherwise. The committee's opening remarks stretched on, procedural and predictable. Cannon's answers were polished to the point of sterility, her every phrase constructed to say much while revealing nothing. Crockett waited, listening the way a surgeon studies a heartbeat before making the first cut. What no one in that chamber realized was how much emotion had been layered beneath this dry exercise in oversight. For Crockett's supporters, immigrants, workers, activists, it wasn't about one case or one judge. It was about the unspoken divide between those who live under rules and those who write them. Every time justice tilted toward power, someone unseen paid the price. As Cannon spoke about judicial independence, Crockett's thoughts drifted to the communities who never had the luxury of independence from the system. People whose accents, zip codes, or skin tones made them defendants in rooms where power never looked like them. This wasn't abstract policy. This was the heartbeat of the country on trial. Then, with a single raised eyebrow, Cannon dismissed a question about perceived bias, calling it politically motivated. A few committee members nodded. Crockett didn't. The words landed like a spark on dry paper. Everyone in the room expected another dull, rehearsed hearing. No one expected what came next. But before Crockett's question shattered the silence, the public had already begun whispering about the judge's troubling past decisions. Before the hearing, before the cameras and the tension, Eileen Cannon's story began far from the noise of public scrutiny. She was the product of meticulous ambition, the kind that hides behind perfect posture and practiced neutrality. Born into comfort, educated among the elite. She learned early that control was power, and power, when held tightly enough, could rewrite any narrative. Professors praised her discipline, mentors noted her restraint, and she wore both as armor. Where others sought empathy, Cannon sought order. To her, compassion was chaos in disguise. Her climb through the legal ranks was deliberate, almost mathematical. Every clerkship chosen for prestige, every ruling calibrated to please the right eyes. She spoke rarely in public, but when she did, her words carried the cool precision of someone certain she was destined to be obeyed. Justice, she once told a law symposium, requires restraint more than reaction. It sounded noble. It also sounded safe. When her nomination came, it was during a time when the judiciary was quietly becoming a battlefield of ideology. She didn't flinch under the spotlight. She smiled with the confidence of someone who believed the robe itself granted sanctity. Senators questioned her in clipped, polite tones, and she returned each volley with detached civility. But behind the mask of calm intellect, she was taking notes, not on the questions, but on who dared to ask them. Her early rulings were cautious, restrained to the point of invisibility. Then came the cases that would define her, decisions involving powerful figures, political controversies, and national headlines. In each, she chose the same path: shield the powerful under the pretext of procedure. To the public, it looked like bias. To Cannon, it was preservation. She told herself that justice had to be protected from the passions of politics. But the irony was cruel. Her protection often served the very interests she claimed to defend justice from. Critics called her rulings judicial activism in reverse. To them, Cannon wasn't blind to influence. She was fluent in it. She crafted opinions that read like sermons to authority, long on order, short on accountability. And when challenged, she met the outrage not with explanation, but with silence. A silence that spoke louder than any defense. In that silence, she seemed to say, "You don't question me? I am the system." Still, Cannon wasn't without conviction. In her mind, America was fraying at the seams because too many questioned too much. She believed the robe's role was to steady the nation's heartbeat, not amplify its noise. She saw protesters as agitators, reformers as destabilizers. Her version of justice was one of hierarchy. Every voice in its proper place, every challenge contained. Stability, she believed, was mercy. Transparency was indulgence. But that philosophy came with a cost. Each ruling widened the gap between the judiciary and the people it claimed to serve. Lawyers whispered that appearing in her courtroom felt like stepping into a cathedral where the sermon was already written. Journalists joked that her gavel didn't strike for justice, it struck for control. The more the criticism grew, the higher she built her walls. Her chambers became legend in legal circles, cold, immaculate, unnervingly quiet. Assistants said she read case files like confessionals, dissecting every word for signs of disobedience. When rulings came down, they were crafted with surgical precision, leaving no trace of hesitation. Even her handwriting was rumored to be immaculate, as if every loop of the pen declared, "I am infallible." And yet, beneath that perfection, a tremor of insecurity lingered, a fear that power once granted could be stripped away by those unwilling to revere it. That fear drove her to overcorrect, to overrule, to overreach. Her decisions weren't just judgments. They were assertions of existence. She had become both protector and prisoner of her own authority. By the time Crockett entered the scene, Cannon had already built a fortress of precedent around herself. Her supporters admired her courage to resist political pressure. Critics called her rulings a love letter to impunity. But the truth was simpler and far more human. She had mistaken control for justice and loyalty for virtue. So when the hearing was announced, an inquiry into judicial ethics, Cannon saw it as an affront, a spectacle designed to humiliate her. She prepared not to answer questions, but to defend her throne. What she didn't anticipate was Jasmine Crockett, a voice too sharp to be ignored, too fearless to be intimidated. In Crockett, Cannon saw not an opponent, but a threat to the order she had built her life upon. A woman who spoke with conviction, who didn't defer to titles, who represented everything Cannon believed the world had too much of emotion, activism, noise. But every empire built on arrogance eventually meets the one voice that refuses to bow. Jasmine Crockett's story didn't begin in marble halls or manicured courtrooms. It began in a part of America that power rarely visits, where voices echo louder than opportunities, where survival teaches a sharper kind of intelligence. She was raised to see struggle not as tragedy, but as training. Her mother worked 2 jobs. Her father fixed what he could and prayed over what he couldn't. Every bill paid was a victory. Every injustice endured was a lesson. By the time she was 10, Crockett had already learned what many adults never do, that silence is a luxury the unheard can't afford. She watched neighbors lose homes over paperwork errors, friends arrested over misunderstandings that didn't require handcuffs, and families torn apart by systems too complex for ordinary people to fight. She didn't grow up dreaming of power. She grew up watching what happened when people had none. In that world, every rule was written elsewhere. Every decision that mattered came from rooms she would one day refuse to fear. Her teachers saw something different in her, a kind of focus that could turn fury into precision. When others rebelled, she argued. When others gave up, she researched. She spoke with the conviction of someone who had already seen the consequences of being ignored. Debate clubs turned into community meetings, and community meetings turned into rallies. By the time she reached law school, she had already decided that her voice would not be used for comfort, it would be used for confrontation. Law school was supposed to break her down, to smooth her edges into compliance. Instead, it forged her into something unyielding. While others competed for clerkships and corporate internships, Crockett spent her nights volunteering in legal aid clinics, defending tenants, immigrants, and workers who didn't have the privilege of being polite. She became known for her empathy, but also for her refusal to dilute the truth. When professors warned her to be more strategic with her tone, she smiled and said, "Maybe the problem isn't my tone. Maybe it's what it echoes." When she entered politics, it wasn't by accident. It was because she got tired of fighting the same fire from outside the building. Her campaign wasn't built on slogans. It was built on stories. People didn't just vote for her. They recognized themselves in her. The single mother who couldn't afford an attorney, the young activist dragged out of a protest, the immigrant family who lost everything to bureaucracy, they all saw in Crockett the same defiance they wished they could afford. Each victory came with scars. She was mocked for being too emotional, too direct, too unwilling to soften her convictions for the comfort of those unaccustomed to truth in its raw form. But what her critics called anger, her supporters called honesty. She carried that duality like a badge, reminding herself that authenticity often offends those who benefit from illusion. There was one case early in her legal career that shaped her philosophy forever. A young man wrongfully accused who couldn't afford bail. The prosecutor pushed hard, certain no one would bother defending him beyond procedure. Crockett tore through the evidence and found what others missed, an overlooked timestamp that dismantled the case. When the verdict came back not guilty, the man wept, but Crockett didn't celebrate. She just looked at the judge and said, "Justice shouldn't depend on who can afford it." The words followed her for years. They became her creed. By the time she reached Congress, she wasn't chasing headlines. The headlines were chasing her. Her fiery exchanges, her refusal to let double standards slide, and her sharp dismantling of hypocrisy turned her into both target and torchbearer. The establishment whispered that she was dangerous. The people said she was necessary. In a city built on compromise, she stood for something that didn't bend, the idea that justice should feel the same no matter who you are. Her presence in hearings was magnetic, calm, yet charged. The kind of confidence that comes from surviving environments where weakness isn't an option. Colleagues often underestimated her, mistaking empathy for softness. But her compassion was not weakness, it was strategy. She knew that rage without reason is noise, and reason without courage is surrender. So she learned to blend both. In Washington's endless echo chamber, Crockett's voice carried differently. It wasn't polished for donors or filtered for diplomacy. It came from somewhere deeper, a place where pain had been translated into purpose. Under the fluorescent glare of Washington, Crockett's voice was not just heard, it resonated. Each word landed like truth rediscovered, ancient and undeniable. She didn't see herself as a savior, and that's what made her dangerous to those who thrived on self-importance. She wasn't there to elevate herself. She was there to level the field. Her speeches reminded people that decency isn't weakness, and that courage doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears exhaustion, and still stands up anyway. So when her name appeared on the docket for the oversight hearing on judicial accountability, she didn't hesitate. She read through Cannon's rulings the way a doctor studies symptoms, recognizing the sickness of arrogance masked as jurisprudence. To others, it was just another political skirmish. To her, it was personal, because she knew what it felt like to live on the wrong side of someone else's order. That day, as she walked into the chamber, she carried more than notes and questions. She carried the weight of every person told to wait their turn, every voice silenced by paperwork and precedent, every face that never made it past the system's locked doors. Her calm wasn't the absence of fear, it was the mastery of it. Across the room, Judge Cannon waited, composed, aloof, unshaken. Crockett glanced at her once and saw not just a woman, but a wall. A wall built to keep truth from trespassing. And for the first time in Cannon's career, that wall was about to be tested by someone who had spent her entire life breaking through them. And on that day, in that room, those two forces, silence and truth, were destined to collide. The hearing chamber buzzed with that peculiar blend of tension and ceremony. Reporters whispering, aides typing, the air thick with quiet expectation. Judge Eileen Cannon sat poised behind the microphone, her expression sculpted into calm authority. No trace of anxiety, no flicker of doubt. Just the serene composure of someone accustomed to control. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett adjusted her papers without looking down. The pen in her hand tapped softly, a metronome marking the countdown to confrontation. The chairman's gavel struck. Cameras zoomed in. "Judge Cannon," he began, "thank you for appearing before this committee." Cannon nodded. "It's an honor to serve," she said, her tone warm but calculated. She spoke like someone reading scripture, careful, deliberate, every syllable weighed to sound unimpeachable. Crockett didn't interrupt. She watched, listened, waited. The questioning began mildly. Inquiries about caseloads, judicial ethics, the perception of fairness. Cannon answered with rehearsed precision, her language thick with institutional insulation. Words like integrity, process, impartiality, the vocabulary of authority. Then, as if puncturing a lull, Crockett's voice cut through the decorum. "Judge Cannon," she said, leaning toward the mic, "you've spoken at length about fairness. Let's test that word." Cannon's eyes shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Congresswoman," Crockett flipped a page. "In your recent decisions regarding the classified documents case, you made rulings that multiple legal scholars across the spectrum described as extraordinary deviations from precedent. Can you explain how fairness applies when your decisions consistently benefit one defendant?" A pause. Then Cannon smiled. That judicial smile meant to signal patience, not warmth. "Congresswoman, I don't make decisions based on outcomes. I make them based on law. I am bound by the Constitution, not commentary." "Commentary?" Crockett echoed. "Judge, when an entire nation's trust in the judiciary is shaken, that's not commentary. That's consequence." The room stilled. A few reporters stopped typing. Cannon folded her hands. "Respectfully, this hearing seems less about jurisprudence and more about politics. I will not be drawn into political theater." Crockett tilted her head. "Politics. The people impacted by your rulings don't call it politics. They call it privilege." A ripple moved through the chamber. Cannon's tone cooled further. "Privilege," she said, "is assuming you can question the judiciary without understanding the law that sustains it." Crockett didn't flinch. "No, Judge. Privilege is believing the law doesn't need to be questioned, even when it bends." Gasps, murmurs. The chairman's gavel struck once, but the sound barely registered. Cannon straightened, her mask of composure flickering. "You're insinuating bias." "I'm illustrating pattern," Crockett replied, her voice steady, surgical. "And patterns tell stories even rulings can't hide." Cannon tried to retreat behind her shield of formalism. "Congresswoman, if we start second-guessing every judicial interpretation, we erode the very foundation of order. Order without accountability," Crockett interrupted, "isn't justice. It's obedience." The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, impossible to unhear. Cannon inhaled, slow and deliberate. "I won't apologize for adhering to process. And maybe the process needs an apology," Crockett shot back. The chairman's eyes darted between them, half fascinated, half alarmed. What began as a hearing had become a duel of philosophies, one cloaked in law, the other blazing with conscience. Cannon shifted tactics. "Congresswoman, with respect, I've dedicated my life to preserving stability. That sometimes means making unpopular choices." Crockett leaned forward. "Stability for whom, Judge? The powerful? The comfortable? Because where I come from, stability usually means someone else is stuck under the weight of it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded, humming with electricity. For the first time, Cannon hesitated. The polished certainty in her voice cracked, revealing a flash of irritation. "I find your tone unsettling," Crockett interjected. "That's how truth feels when it walks into rooms that weren't built for it." Somewhere in the back, a journalist whispered, "She's landing blows." Cameras zoomed closer. The entire country, watching through screens, could feel the energy shift. The immaculate calm of the judge, slowly eroding under the heat of public reckoning. Cannon tried one last refuge. "My record speaks for itself." "Yes," Crockett replied. "And that's exactly what we're listening to." Cannon blinked, her jaw tightening. The fortress she'd built from decorum and authority was beginning to fracture. For years, she'd spoken from the bench, where her word was final. Now, under Crockett's gaze, her certainty looked fragile. Each exchange sharpened the divide between them, power versus principle, detachment versus accountability. The hearing had started as oversight, but now it had become something far bigger. A reckoning not just for one judge, but for a system that had learned to confuse restraint with righteousness. Crockett paused, setting her pen down deliberately. The tension was unbearable, every eye in the chamber fixed on her, waiting. Then she looked directly at Cannon and asked, her voice calm but piercing, "Judge, tell me this, if justice can't be questioned, who does it really serve?" No one moved. Even the air seemed to stop breathing. Then came the question that turned the entire hearing into a national reckoning. For a full second after Jasmine Crockett's question, nothing moves. The air thickens into silence so absolute, it feels like a living thing. Every head in the chamber tilts slightly toward the woman who just detonated the unspoken rule. That judges are to be revered, not confronted. The fluorescent lights hum louder. Cameras zoom in so close that even the micro-tremor in Eileen Cannon's jaw becomes visible. "So, Your Honor," Crockett repeats softly, "are you saying justice depends on who's asking for it?" The words land like a scalpel, not shouted, not thrown, but delivered with the precision of someone who knows exactly where the truth hides. Cannon blinks once. Her lips part slightly, but no words come. The gavel in her hand, polished to a mirror sheen, trembles just enough to betray her. Her authority, once absolute, now looks borrowed, something she's holding on to by habit, not conviction. Crockett waits. The silence becomes unbearable. Even the clock on the back wall seems louder. Tick, tick, tick. When Cannon finally speaks, her voice is a shade lower. "Congresswoman, your insinuation is inappropriate. This hearing is not a place for moral theater." Crockett doesn't look away. Neither is a courtroom, but that hasn't stopped injustice from performing there. A gasp rolls through the audience. One of Cannon's aides lowers his gaze. Another scribbles something frantically on a notepad, pretending not to notice the unfolding collapse of composure at the front of the room. Crockett continues, her tone still measured, but now carrying that undercurrent of steel. "Let me remind you, Judge, the Constitution wasn't written to protect power from scrutiny. It was written to protect people from power. And right now, millions are watching to see whether that still means something." Cannon opens her mouth to respond, but Crockett isn't finished. Her cadence sharpens, deliberate, rhythmic, impossible to interrupt. When your rulings consistently shelter privilege and punish transparency, that's not neutrality. That's allegiance. You say order matters, but whose order? You call it stability, but who gets silence to keep it? The chamber vibrates with tension. Crockett's voice is calm, factual, but every syllable hits like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Cannon exhales slowly, searching for the safety of procedure. "Congresswoman, this committee is exceeding its authority. Judicial independence. Judicial independence doesn't mean judicial immunity." Crockett cuts in, her tone almost gentle, the kind of calm that only truth can afford. "You've used that phrase like armor, but today it sounds more like a shield for convenience." The audience murmurs. Even the chairman looks frozen between protocol and awe. Crockett glances briefly at her notes, then back up. "When you took your oath, you swore to uphold the Constitution. Not to preserve comfort. Not to protect one man's reputation. The same Constitution that gives you authority gives this Congress the duty to question it. That's not defiance. That's democracy." Cannon shifts in her chair, her poise slipping. Her usual calm precision dissolves into visible unease. She tries to summon the courtroom tone that once subdued entire rooms. "Congresswoman, I will not." Crockett doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't need to. "You will answer," she says quietly. "Because if justice depends on who's asking, then justice is already lost." The sentence cuts through the room like thunder in a cathedral. No one dares to speak. No one dares to move. The cameras zoom in again, Crockett's steady expression framed against Cannon's uneasy stillness. Staffers exchange looks. One bites her lip. Another stares at his notes, pretending to read what he can't focus on. Outside the chamber, the world begins to move faster. News alerts flash on phones. Clips hit social media before the final word echoes. Crockett grills Cannon, the question that stunned the bench. Within minutes, hashtags bloom like wildfire. Hashtag justice depends. Hashtag Crockett vs. Cannon. Hashtag the question. Inside, the sound of that single question still hovers, undiminished, immortal. Cannon, visibly unsettled, leans forward. "You presume to question my integrity?" "No," Crockett replies, her tone steady as glass. "I question the system that lets integrity go unchecked. You just happen to be its face today." A collective intake of breath. The hierarchy of the room dissolves entirely. For the first time, Cannon lowers her gaze. Her fingers tighten around the gavel, but she doesn't raise it. Power, when cornered by truth, often looks like silence. Crockett exhales softly, then straightens the papers before her. "Justice doesn't fear questions, Your Honor," she says. "Only those who can't answer them." Sentence lands with a finality that no gavel could match. Another long silence. Reporters stare, motionless. Even the hum of the lights seems to pause in reverence. Then, like a dam breaking, the room erupts. Whispers, shuffling, the rapid-fire clicking of cameras. Crockett doesn't move. She doesn't gloat. Her composure remains intact, cool, dignified, unshaken. She gathers her notes as though nothing extraordinary just happened, her face illuminated by a quiet, knowing calm. Cannon, still behind the bench, looks smaller now, the robe that once symbolized invincibility, now a shroud of discomfort. The chairman clears his throat, voice cracking slightly. "The committee will stand in recess." But no one's listening. The moment has already transcended the room. Outside, television anchors scramble for live feeds. Editorial boards prepare emergency columns. Cable panels ignite. Crockett's question, one host says breathlessly, has just redefined judicial accountability in real time. Another adds, it wasn't an argument, it was a mirror. Within hours, split-screen debates dominate every network. Commentators dissect tone, body language, intent. Memes flood the internet. Cannon frozen mid-blink. Crockett mid-sentence. Captions blazing. Justice doesn't fear questions. Yet through all the noise, the original clip speaks for itself. No edits, no overdubs. Just that moment of stillness after truth hit the air. Some call it arrogance, others courage. But everyone agrees something cracked that day in the marble walls of power. Crockett, back in her office later, scrolls through the headlines without expression. Her staffers cheer quietly in the background, but she doesn't join in. She simply places her phone face down and looks out the window toward the Capitol. The city glows, restless, awake. Her words are already echoing across screens and timelines, yet she knows the fight isn't over. It never is. Because power never concedes with one question. But sometimes one question is enough to make it flinch. And what happened outside that chamber was even more shocking. It started within seconds. The clip, 28 seconds of unbroken tension, hit the internet before the echo of Crockett's words had even faded from the marble walls. Within minutes, Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube lit up like a lightning storm over Washington. The hashtags came first. Hashtag Crockett vs. Cannon, hashtag question of justice, hashtag who fears the question. Then came the edits. Slow motion replays of the moment. Cannon's jaw tightened. Freeze frames of Crockett's calm expression as her words landed like precision strikes. By noon, the phrase "Justice doesn't fear questions" was printed across t-shirts, memes, and protest signs. College students shared it as motivation. Activists quoted it in live streams. Even apolitical corners of the internet turned it into art, rhythm, remix, mantra. Commentators called it the moment truth punched through decorum. On cable panels, familiar faces dissected the confrontation frame by frame. One legal analyst said it was a public unmasking, the courtroom veil torn away. Another dismissed it as grandstanding dressed up as courage. But the split didn't matter. What mattered was that everyone everywhere was talking about it. In talk shows, late-night hosts played the clip with mock tension music. Freezing the exact second Cannon blinked, joking. "That's the blink of realization right there." Crowds laughed. But the laughter carried weight, collective recognition that something long overdue had happened. Op-eds flooded the morning papers. One headline read, "Crockett reminds America who justice serves." Another countered, "A dangerous precedent when politicians cross the bench." The battle lines were clear, but the moral undercurrent was shifting. For once, the conversation wasn't about party. It was about power and who dared to question it. Outside federal courthouses, protesters gathered holding signs. "No one above question. Truth over titles. Justice needs witnesses." The movement wasn't orchestrated. It was organic, electric, spreading faster than any campaign could engineer. In coffee shops and classrooms, people debated not just the moment, but what it revealed. The questions Crockett asked Cannon now hung over every institution that had gone unchallenged for too long. Meanwhile, inside the establishment, silence became the loudest sound. Cannon's usual defenders, commentators who once praised her courage under fire, suddenly turned cautious. Some issued lukewarm statements about judicial decorum. Others disappeared entirely from the weekend shows. A few, sensing the public tide, began to hedge. Perhaps the Congresswoman's question, all pointed, reflects legitimate concern. Cannon herself retreated from the spotlight. Her staff canceled appearances. A planned judiciary conference quietly removed her from the keynote lineup. Rumors swirled that she felt misunderstood and betrayed by the media, but official comments never came. Crockett, by contrast, became a lightning rod of energy. Her social media accounts overflowed with messages from students, veterans, single mothers, and immigrants who said they finally felt seen. "You spoke for us," one message read. "You reminded them we pay attention." Another simply said, "Thank you for not flinching." She didn't post celebratory videos or statements. Her only public response came through a brief post. Questions are not attacks. Accountability is not chaos. Democracy breathes when power listens. That line alone gathered millions of likes and shares. It became the, quote, anchors used to close their segments, the caption under every viral clip. On Capitol Hill, whispers began about new hearings on judicial ethics. Law professors cited Crockett's question in essays about institutional integrity. Even rival politicians, careful not to appear partisan, admitted privately that she struck a chord. But for every surge of admiration came the countercurrent of backlash. Conservative pundits labeled her reckless, disrespectful, even dangerous. A few called her tone unbecoming, yet each attempt to dismiss her only amplified the story. The clips replayed, the quotes reprinted, and the question, her question, kept echoing. Does justice depend on who's asking for it? The irony was inescapable. The very system that once tried to silence voices like hers had now become the stage for her defiance. Crockett hadn't just questioned a judge. She had questioned the culture of untouchability that shielded those draped in authority. Even in international press, the story made waves. Foreign newspapers ran headlines like, "Congresswoman confronts us judge in historic hearing." Comment sections filled with readers from around the world drawing parallels to their own justice systems, their own silences. In classrooms, professors paused their lectures to play the clip. In community centers, people watched it together, nodding as if witnessing proof that someone, somewhere, still had the courage to speak unfiltered truth to power. As the days passed, the initial shock began to settle into something deeper, reflection. People who had never watched a congressional hearing before now discussed judicial accountability like it was personal, because it was. The nation had seen what it looked like when confidence met arrogance, when calm defiance stripped power of its myth, and they had chosen their hero. Even Cannon's silence spoke volumes. Each day she refused to respond only magnified the imbalance Crockett had exposed. The contrast between someone who deflected and someone who confronted. Editorials began ending with a version of the same line. Power flinched, and the country noticed. And as the dust settled, one truth became undeniable. Power had been confronted, and it blinked first. When the uproar finally faded, when the headlines began to quiet and the clips stopped looping on every screen, what remained was not outrage, it was clarity, the kind that lingers long after the noise. Because this was never just about a question, or even about two women locked in a clash of conviction. It was about the architecture of democracy itself, how it bends, how it breaks, and how sometimes it needs someone brave enough to knock on its walls to see if they still hold. Eileen Cannon embodied the old world, one where authority spoke and everyone else listened, where robes conferred reverence and accountability was seen as intrusion. Her silence that day wasn't just personal defeat, it was symbolic. It revealed what happens when power forgets that respect must be earned, not demanded. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, didn't just challenge a judge, she redefined what challenge means. She proved that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. Her courage wasn't loud or angry. It was precise, steady, deliberate, the kind that doesn't seek applause, but provokes reflection. And maybe that's why her question cut so deep. It wasn't rebellion, it was restoration. A reminder that justice, at its core, belongs to the people who dare to ask if it's still being served. For years, Americans had grown used to the ritual of spectacle, hearings that began with promise and ended in nothing. But this one was different. It broke through cynicism. It forced a reckoning with something we'd forgotten, that democracy is not sustained by titles or traditions, but by those willing to hold them to their purpose. Crockett's moment of defiance became something larger than herself. It was civic courage, the rare kind that doesn't come from ambition, but from conscience. The courage to speak even when the room isn't listening. To question even when the answer might come at a cost. Her words rippled far beyond Washington. They reached classrooms where teachers asked their students what justice really means. They reached living rooms where families debated whether truth still has a place in politics. They reached people who'd long stopped believing their voices mattered and reminded them that they always had. In a nation divided by headlines and hashtags, this moment stood as a bridge. Not because it solved anything instantly, but because it dared to name what had gone unspoken. Power unchecked had grown too comfortable. Truth had become too polite. Indignity, the quiet kind that refuses to bow, had been waiting for someone to bring it back into the light. So when Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat that day, gathering her papers with calm finality, the image felt almost cinematic. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply stood, the sunlight from the tall windows spilling across her shoulders. Cameras flashing in bursts of white light that caught the edges of her determined face. Behind her, the chamber buzzed, aides whispering, journalists typing, history rearranging itself in real time. Ahead of her, the corridor stretched long and bright, like a promise waiting to be kept. In that walk there was poetry, the kind written not with words, but with conviction. She had asked one question, and in doing so, forced a nation to answer for itself. For all the noise and controversy, something pure emerged, a reminder that democracy survives not through silence, but through the courage to speak when silence becomes complicity. And as Crockett stepped into the light, the world outside seemed to lean closer, listening for what might come next. Because for millions watching, this wasn't just a hearing, it was a turning point. Judge Eileen Cannon challenged Jasmine Crockett. It was Crockett's question that left the room, and the country speechless. In a world where power often hides behind protocol, where truth is dressed up, delayed, or deflected, one voice dared to ask the simplest question, and everything stopped. It wasn't anger that silenced the room. It was clarity. A reminder that justice doesn't belong to those who wear the robe or hold the gavel. It belongs to those who still believe in asking why. Crockett didn't just confront a judge. She confronted a culture. She reminded America that integrity isn't inherited, it's proven. That courage isn't about volume, it's about conviction. And that the right question asked at the right time can echo louder than any verdict. Because truth doesn't need permission, and courage doesn't ask for comfort. It simply steps forward, steady and unafraid, knowing that silence only serves the powerful. So if you believe questions still matter in a free democracy, share this story, subscribe, speak up, and stand with those who dare to hold power accountable. Because sometimes, one question changes everything.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to take the time that we have here to raise an unrelated issue. You can relax.
Thank you.